There was a mystery deep in the windswept plains of Montana, under layers of old soil and quiet, that would change all we thought we knew about American history. It wasn't gold. It wasn't worth anything. It was something much more valuable. The DNA of a child who lived and died almost 13,000 years ago. This wasn't just a find. It was a discovery that was about to blow up. Because underneath those weak bones was a genetic code so strong that it ended decades of scientific disagreement and revealed a story that no one saw coming. When scientists finally figured out the DNA of that ancient youngster, they found more than simply a relative. They found the starting point, the spark that gave birth to a whole hemisphere. But the most surprising part? The narrative of the child didn't start in Montana. His family held the traces of an ancient migration that went halfway around the world, over frozen oceans, vanished countries, and even time itself. This is the story of the youngster who brought two worlds together. The child who showed that the first Americans didn't merely come here, they took over. It all started by chance. Two construction workers were cutting through sandstone in Wilsall, Montana in 1968. It was simply another cold, windy day on the plains. The men were using their machines to dig deep into the mountainside to get materials for building a road. But then, the backhoe's shovel hit something else. Something that didn't sound like a rock. They turned off the engine, dug a tiny bit by hand, and there, only 6 feet below the surface, they found it. Bone. Not an animal. Person. At first, no one knew how big what they had uncovered was. A little skeleton, curled up like it was sleeping. There were more than 100 stone tools among the bones, including fine spear points, knives, and blades that were precisely formed. Each one was carved in a way that archaeologists could tell right away. Clovis. That word meant everything to scientists. The Clovis people were the first known society to sweep throughout North America. They were like ghosts from the past. They were hunters, explorers, and experts at staying alive. And now, in Montana, there was a grave that was unlike any other. The youngster, who was just 2 years old when he died, was buried with the same attention that is typically given to kings. The implements, the way they were set up, and the bright red ochre hue all showed that this was a rite with a lot of meaning. Red ochre was more than just adornment. It was holy. It stood for life, blood, and new life. The person who buried this boy didn't merely grieve him, they paid their respects to him. 30 pounds of that red powder had been thrown into his grave, covering every tool and bone like a red shroud. It seemed like his people wanted to make sure that the child's spirit would always be strong, even after he died. Archaeologists named it the Anzick site for the family that owned the area, but over time, it became known by a different name, the spot where American identity began. For years, this little burial was like a puzzle that couldn't be solved. The tools told a tale. The bones gave a hint about another, but the question still stood. Who was this child, and what did his people stand for? It would take 45 years to find the solution. The Anzick site was amazing, but it couldn't tell us the truth about the child's DNA. A revolution in science had started by the early 2000s. Scientists had figured out how to get ancient DNA out of bones and put it in order. For the first time, humans could read the genetic traces of people who lived tens of thousands of years ago. It was like opening a time capsule that had been written in code. A group of scientists in Denmark, led by geneticist Eske Willerslev, agreed to take on the Anzick child. It was a risk because no one had ever tried to sequence DNA this old from the Americas before. The bones were weak. The DNA broke down. Soil, air, and even human contact could have ruined everything. But they gave it a shot nonetheless. They delicately drilled a hole in the boy's tiny skull, collecting dust that had been there for almost 13,000 years. They passed it through cutting-edge machinery that put billions of tiny parts back together like pieces of a broken mirror. Months moved into weeks. The computers hummed and data came in, and suddenly a sequence showed up. They had done it. The Anzick child's DNA had been completely deciphered. What it showed would change the history of a whole hemisphere. First came the confirmation. The boy was Clovis, the oldest and most widespread culture in early North America. But his genetic makeup indicated a more complicated story. It didn't match Europe, as some fringe theories originally said, but ancient Siberia. This wasn't just a little thing. It was a fatal blow to the Solutrean hypothesis, which said that the first Americans traveled by sea from Ice Age Europe. But the DNA was clear. The Anzick child's forefathers came from Asia and crossed the frozen Bering Land Bridge during the last ice age. That bridge, which used to be a huge tundra that connected Siberia and Alaska, was the road of people. It was the way the first people got to the New World. But that wasn't the big surprise. The true shock occurred when the researchers looked at the boy's genome and compared it to that of present indigenous people all around the Americas. The link was clear. From the Inuit in the Arctic to the Navajo in the Southwest to the Maya and the Mapuche, thousands of miles south. This one child from Montana was the direct ancestor of almost every Native American group that is still alive today. 80% of indigenous people alive today could trace their ancestry back to the same genetic branch. The rest still had a clear but distant connection. This wasn't just any kid, in other words. He was the ancestor of almost everyone in the world. The world was shocked by the discovery. For the first time, science backed up what indigenous oral traditions had stated for hundreds of years, that their people had been present from the beginning of time and were all from the same place. But every answer brought up another inquiry. How did the earliest Americans get so far, so quickly, if they came from Siberia? For a long time, archaeologists had been curious about how people could travel more than 10,000 miles from Alaska to Chile in just a few thousand years. The DNA of the Anzick infant gave a hint. It claimed that there was one tiny but very adaptable group of people who spread across the continents when the glaciers started to melt. They didn't just walk about, they rose quickly. Their descendants spread out to the farthest parts of the Americas within 1,000 years or so. They created cultures, languages, and traditions that would last for thousands of years. In short, it was the fastest growth of people in history, but there was something much deeper in that discovery, an epiphany about what it meant to be human. Scientists detected hints of extraordinary resilience when they looked more closely at the Anzick genome. This wasn't a group of folks who were lucky enough to survive. These were folks who could handle everything, explorers who faced the impossible and thrived. And it all started with one kid. His bones had been quiet for hundreds of years, a whisper in the dust. Now, his DNA said more than any book or object ever could. But as the scientific community rejoiced, a new dilemma began to arise, one that would challenge the very moral principles of archaeology. Who has the authority to narrate this tale? The Anzick infant was not merely a scientific specimen. He was like family to a lot of people. Montana's Crow, Northern Cheyenne, and Salish tribes all thought for a long time that their ancestors came from this country. It wasn't a surprise when they found out that the DNA verified their link. It was a confirmation. This wasn't a discovery for them. It was a return home. But the scientists had a problem. Was it acceptable to study the bones of an ancestor? To cut into sacred remains for the sake of knowledge? Indigenous groups had worked for decades to keep the remains of their ancestors safe from abuse and exploitation. They didn't think of these as relics. They were holy beings that needed to rest. And suddenly, the Anzick youngster was the focus of that argument. Would science take him, or would he be sent back to the place where he came from? It took a while to make the decision. Scientists recognized that if they wanted their discovery to signify more than just numbers and headlines, they had to gain the trust of the people whose narrative they were conveying. Eskev Willerslev and his crew performed something that is quite rare in archaeology. They contacted the tribes of Montana, including the Crow, the Blackfeet, the Northern Cheyenne, and others whose territory near the discovery site. Before they publicized any of their discoveries, they didn't arrive with any requests. They arrived with respect. They sat in tribal lodges and community centers and showed the elders what they had found. They said that the child's DNA linked him and them to a family line that had been going strong for almost 13,000 years. The room was quiet. After that, the elders nodded one by one. The tribes already knew this. It proved what they had always known, that their forefathers had been here since the dawn of time. Their stories said that they came from the country and walked with mammoths and big herds. The science hadn't changed what had happened in the past. It had just caught up to it. But the question still hung in the air. What should happen to the child's body? The bones had been in storage for decades, where they were analyzed, cataloged, and put away in a museum. But the people of Montana thought that wasn't a good location for a youngster. They wanted him to come home. After years of talking and working together, a conclusion was finally made. The scientists, the Anzick family, and people from nearby tribes all decided that the boy should be buried again, not as an item, but as an ancestor. The Anzick boy was buried again on a tranquil summer day in 2014, almost 50 years after he was found. There were no cameras there, no media frenzy. The only sounds were the lovely wind through the grass and the quiet murmur of traditional tunes. Tribal members draped the body in a buffalo robe, which showed how much they cared, and buried him in a private place so that he wouldn't be disturbed this time. At that moment, something amazing happened. Science and soul, two worlds that don't always get along, came together. There was more to it than just a burial. It was a coming together of the living and the dead, of development and tradition. The Anzick youngster had brought together not just continents, but also hearts. But that wasn't the end of his legacy. Researchers started comparing the genome to DNA from other ancient remains recovered in the Americas once they decoded it. What they found offered a stunning picture of how people moved, changed, and survived. The Anzick child's folks came from Siberia and crossed into Beringia, a huge plain that is now underwater and used to connect Asia and Alaska. They lingered there for thousands of years, cut off from the rest of the world by glaciers. Their genomes started to change throughout that period, creating a distinctive signature that would set the first Americans apart. Then, as the ice sheets started to melt, a path opened up. They went south quickly. Within under 1,000 years, the descendants of that first migration had made it to the southern point of South America. Can you believe that? Families walking thousands of kilometers over cold tundra, forests, deserts, and mountains to see a whole new world. People used to think that archaeological sites like Monteverde in Chile were inconceivable, but now they make sense. People might have gotten to those regions a long time ago, even before the Clovis culture. It was as if the Anzick child's DNA had opened a hidden map of how brave people are. But there was more to this news than met the eye. For decades, experts have disagreed about whether the Americas were home to several separate groups of people who came at different times. The DNA told a different story. Almost all of the indigenous peoples in North, Central, and South America came from the same place. One bunch, one growth, a single family. People used to think that the Clovis people were a separate group of hunters, but they were actually part of a huge network of people who came from another world and spread like wildfire. But the Anzick child was more than just his DNA. It was the message he sent across time. This finding wasn't only about where a continent came from. It was about connection, a reminder that we all have deeper roots than we think, no matter where we came from. Every cell in our body tells a story, and his story, the story of a boy buried in the frigid ground of Montana, was one that went back 13,000 years to remind us of who we are. But not everyone was ready to listen. Some scientists had a hard time accepting what it meant. For almost 100 years, textbooks have mostly used the Clovis first idea. It was the most important thing in American archaeology. At this point, that base was starting to break. The Anzick infant showed that people had come to the Americas earlier than everyone assumed. The Clovis were not the beginning. They were just a part of a much longer story. Other archaeologists stuck to other ideas, like the idea that people may have migrated earlier or crossed the sea. But even then, the genetic data pointed to a single ancestral pulse, a shared beginning that linked all the theories. It made me feel small. The oldest American child in the world has changed the rules. But that was also a little scary. The Anzick youngster solved one riddle, but in doing so, they uncovered another that was hard to figure out. What happened to the Clovis people? The Clovis culture disappeared within a few hundred years after this child's burial. The archaeological records stopped showing their implements, which were so different and advanced. The big animals they hunted, such mammoths, mastodons, and huge bison, are now extinct. Something had taken place. Was it the weather, hunting too much, sickness, or maybe something more stranger, a disaster that spread over the continent like fire? Some scientists point to the Younger Dryas, which happened about 12,900 years ago and suddenly brought back Ice Age temperatures. The temperature dropped. Ecosystems fell apart. In certain places, the evidence points to huge wildfires that might have been caused by a cosmic impact. If this is accurate, it means that the Anzick infant was born into a world that was on the verge of extinction. But his descendants lived on. They changed, lived, and rebuilt. The Clovis people are gone, but their descendants continue on in every tribe, nation, and indigenous group from Alaska to Patagonia. The boys' DNA wasn't only a record of what had happened, it was proof that they had lived, a message inscribed in blood and time that stated, "We were here, we are still here." That message is quite strong, but it also raises a bigger challenge that goes beyond science. How far should we go in our effort to comprehend the past? When does being curious cross the line? The Anzick youngster provided us answers that no book could, but it came at a price, disturbing a sacred resting place. And while his reburial provided calm, it also left behind a reminder that not all knowledge is ours to claim. Scientists have been walking a thin line between discovery and defilement, between curiosity and respect, for years. The Anzick child made the world face that line head-on. This was proof that science and spirit could get along. They may work together, one reaching forward via data and DNA, and the other reaching back through memory and tradition, both finding the same truth. Eske Willerslev didn't merely talk about genetics or migration when he told tribe elders what he had found. He talked of becoming part of something. He assured them that this boy was more than just a link to the past. He was family, and for the first time, the elders understood that science could honor their ancestors instead of getting rid of them. The question still stood, what do we do with what we know now? Once you find out that one child is the ancestor of everyone on the continent, the meaning of American history is changed forever. It's no longer only a story about how Europe found out about the West. It started thousands of years ago in the frigid wastelands of Beringia, where nomadic families built little fires to stay warm as they crossed into a new world. The DNA of the Anzick infant showed us that long before Columbus set sail, every peak, valley, and river in the Americas had already been named and known. And that understanding impacted me harder than any news story. This was not a surprise for Indigenous peoples. It was proof. Their oral traditions have told of their presence here since the beginning of time. Now, their stories had scientific verification, not in print, but in the double helix of a long-dead child. But for scientists, it was a whole different story. The Anzick genome became like a Rosetta Stone, a master key for figuring out how early human populations were related genetically. People compared every new ancient skeleton they found, from Alaska to Brazil to his. And over again, his DNA looked like a fingerprint, proving that all of these people were related to each other. It turns out that the earliest Americans didn't merely survive after crossing the land bridge. They thrived. Their children formed two primary groups. One stayed in the far north, where it gave rise to Arctic groups like the Dean and the Athabascans. The other group moved south, quickly filling up the rest of North and South America in an expansion that was almost too fast to believe. They had gotten to the end of the planet in just a few thousand years. They learned to live in many kinds of places on the continent, from glaciers to grasslands, deserts to rainforests. Scientists used to think that they must have come from different places because their cultures, languages, and traditions were so different. But no, they were one people, linked by time and blood. They all sprang from the same little group of people who buried a little kid in the red earth of Montana. The story that started in one grave now spanned two continents. And yet, as the science got clearer, the tale of people got deeper. Think about what the youngster might have gone through in their last moments. His relatives, who were hunters, toolmakers, and survivors of the Ice Age, were all around him in grief. They didn't know how to write, but they had a ceremony. They meant something. They covered him in red ochre, which made it look like they were giving him back to the heartbeat of the soil. They buried him with tools, not as things he owned, but as signs, keeping safe on the way ahead. They had no idea that their act of love would be remembered for 13,000 years. They couldn't have known that his little bones would one day convey the stories of all the people who lived after him, but they must have felt it in some way, because what they did wasn't by chance. It was planned, holy, and everlasting. The Anzick burial was more than just a goodbye. It was a sign. It said, "We were here." It said, "This is our land." And today, thanks to science, everyone in the world knows it's true. But here's something no one tells you. Discoveries like this don't only change history, we change it by how we use them. After the Anzick DNA findings came out, something amazing happened. Geneticists started working with Indigenous people all throughout the Americas for the first time, not merely as subjects, but also also as partners. Tribes started to take back their stories from the past, which changed how the world saw their past. There was no longer a story about them. They told the story. That's what the Anzick child left behind. He didn't only change the past, he helped us change the way we find it. For too long, archaeology was about who owned what, who got to dig, who got to name, and who got to claim the past. But the Anzick find revealed that science doesn't own the past. It belongs to the living generations who have that story in their blood. One tribe elder said, "He's one of ours, and he's finally home," when the reburial happened in 2014. That sentence stated more than any research study ever could. That's what this was all about. Under all the numbers, the analysis, and the arguments. A return home. A reunion that took 13,000 years to happen. And that takes us to the main point of this story. Not what was found, but what was remembered. The DNA of the Anzick child may have filled the pages of books and journals, but his spirit filled something much deeper. The space between knowing and understanding. We now know how the earliest Americans' genes are linked to each other. We know where they originated from, how they got around, and what they turned into. But do we know what it means to have such knowledge? It is hard to open the tombs of ancestors just to find out what is inside. Science looks for answers, but certain answers need to be respected. The last lesson of the Anzick child might not only be about where they came from, it might have something to do with being humble, because what he taught us, and what his people already knew, is that history doesn't belong to the most advanced technology or the loudest voice. It is for those who remember, people who listen, people who care enough to keep the story going. A family buried their child in the frigid ground of Montana 13,000 years ago. Today, that same country is home to their descendants, whose voices, traditions, and bloodlines are still strong. And in that, there is something that will never change. The DNA of the Anzick child changed American history, but maybe what it really showed us is something even older, that our stories are all connected. They are all connected by time, love, and the urge to belong. The scientists found some information, the tribes found the truth, and they both made a connection. As you listen to this story about a tiny child whose bones changed everything, ask yourself this: are we remembering to honor the past while we hurry to find it? Because the best discovery might not be buried in the dirt at all. Maybe it's how we choose to perceive each other across continents, centuries, and the thin, delicate line between life and death. That's probably what it means to really change history.